Hi guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. So in today's video, second video of the day, we are going to be doing chapter 28, and it focuses on expenditure multipliers with emphasis to the Keynesian model. So let us first define what the Keynesian model is all about. So the Keynesian model is a model that explains the fluctuations in the economy, the fluctuations of aggregate demand at a fixed price level by identifying forces that determine planned expenditure. So what the Keynesian model does is that it's going to explain increases and decreases in aggregate demand, but at a fixed price level. And how does it do this? It does this by identifying the forces that determine planned expenditure, right? So we have three things here: fluctuations, right, of aggregate demand measured at fixed price levels. How do they do this? By identifying forces that determine planned expenditure. So let us define what planned expenditure is. But before we do that, let us look at what aggregate expenditure really means. So aggregate, as you guys know, means total. So aggregate expenditure is the total expenditure of the whole economy, right? And it's gonna include your consumption, your investment, your government, your expenditure less your imports, sum of all those things, right? It's basically your GDP, right? Your GDP. So then, now that we know what aggregate expenditure is, let us look at what exactly is planned expenditure. So planned expenditure is the sum of all these things, but those that you planned beforehand, right? That's what you planned to consume. That's what you planned to invest. That's what the government planned to spend. That's what you planned to buy, right? To buy as imports, and that's what you planned to buy as exports, right? So that's what planned expenditure is all about. It's about what you pre-planned beforehand, right? The components that you pre-planned to buy, right? So consumption expenditure and imports. So those are the only two things that depend on income, and as a result, they depend on real GDP. So we are saying this component as well as this component. So we're saying that the ones that I'm doing in this component and this component depend on income. How much you consume depends on the disposable income that you have, and how much you import depends on the disposable income that you have. But investment is pre-decided, right? It's based on the real interest rate, and it's based on the expected profits. Government expenditure is based on the budget, right, as per the fiscal policy. So exports are based on what the whole world wants. They are based on what is happening around the world. They are based on the foreign exchange markets. So those things are not dependent on your income, right? And as a result, they are not affected by, they don't actually inform real GDP, right? So you'll see that as we continue, consumption and imports are going to give us what we call autonomous spending, whereas investment, government, and exports are going to give us induced spending, right? And these three are independent of disposable income, and they're independent of real GDP. So yes, so let us continue. So an increase in real GDP increases the aggregate demand, and an increase in the aggregate demand increases real GDP, right? So that's the two-way link that we look at in this chapter, that whenever you have an increase in whenever you have an increase in real GDP, your aggregate expenditure is also gonna increase. And when you have an increase in demand, you're also gonna have an increase in real GDP, right? So this chapter is a bit long, so I'll try to be as fast as I can, but leaving no one behind. So remember, we said that the Keynesian model, right, explains the fluctuations that we have when prices are fixed based on planned expenditures, right, based on planned consumption. So now we need to ask ourselves, what influences planned consumption. And we have 4 things that do that. The first one is disposable income. Disposable income is going to inform your planned expenditure, right? So if you're going to have more income, you're going to spend more, right? And then real interest rates. Well, expected future income. So let us look at each one of them in depth. So the first one says disposable income. What is disposable income? As you guys can hear the term disposable income, the income that you can dispose of, right? So that means that it is the income that you can spend on goods and services. It is the income that you receive less the taxes, because the amount of your income that goes to taxes is not disposable. So disposable income is going to be the income that you receive less the taxes, the amount of taxes that you have to pay. Hence I say income that you can spend on goods and services, right? Aggregate income, remember when we started with GDP, right? When we started like macroeconomics, we talked about the 3 methods of calculating GDP. We said we have the income method, we have the expenditure method, and we have the production method. And we said that these methods give us GDP and they are equal. So meaning that the aggregate income, which I am interested in this case, is actually equal to my aggregate expenditure, and it is also equal to my aggregate production, and it is my real GDP, right? So disposable income depends. This shows if my income is equal to my real GDP, that means that the disposable income is actually dependent on my real GDP, and the real GDP is also dependent on my aggregate income. Remember, this is a two-way street because it's an equal sign, right? So disposable income depends on real GDP, and real GDP depends on disposable income, right? So this is a two-way street. So as I said, disposable income is aggregate income minus taxes. And disposable income, where does your disposable income go, right? And remember that when I say disposable income, I mean you've already taken your aggregate income minus your taxes. The income that is left after you've subtracted your taxes is your disposable income. So where does that income actually go? It either goes to consumption or it goes to savings. It's either you consume the income that you have or you save the income. So disposable income is also equal to planned consumption expenditure plus your savings, right? So now we look at the relationship between my consumption expenditure, right? What I'm talking about here, the planned expenditure. So everything is building up. I started by showing you the relationship between my disposable income and real GDP. And then I defined what disposable income is. And a component of the disposable income looks at planned consumption expenditure, right? Because remember, the whole bigger picture is that I'm looking at the Keynesian model, and it's explaining the fluctuations in my aggregate demand, like by fixing my prices and focusing on planned expenditures. And we said, what influences planned expenditure? Number 1, disposable income. That's what I am at now. And a component of disposable income is planned consumption expenditure. Now moving on, right? So I'm taking it piece by piece. Now I am at planned consumption expenditure, and they start introducing the consumption function, right? And they say the relationship between the consumption expenditure and the disposable income is actually called the consumption function. So when I look at the relationship between this part and this part, I call that my consumption function. So the relationships that I'm giving you guys here are actually based on what I just defined. I said disposable income either goes to consumption or savings. Now they are giving me 2 functions that have to do with these 2 pillars. The first one gives me the consumption function, which is actually the relationship between my disposable income as well as my planned expenditure. And then they tell me the second function, and it is the relationship between my disposable income and my savings, right? And we call that function a saving function, right? Hope you guys are still following. Okay, let us continue, right? And then they start actually showing us how it looks. I am so sorry about these black lines. I actually tried to highlight a graph that I was drawing. It ended up doing this. So sorry about this, guys. Don't mind these lines, just focus on this. So we have the consumption function, and the consumption function is actually this line right here, this one, not the one that starts at the origin, this yellowish line, right? So that is my consumption function. And if you guys look at this is so distracting, but I'm sorry. So if you look at this line, you have A, B, and you have A, B, and C, right? Let's call this D. So you have A, B, and C. So on this consumption line, you have different points. On point A, this is disposable income. On your x-axis, this is consumption expenditure. So on point A, do you guys see that disposable income is 0, but there's still consumption. So we call this consumption autonomous spending. So autonomous spending is spending that occurs without any disposable income. So you might ask yourself, how are they spending without income? That income is going to come from things like transfer payments, the 350 grant that is being given to people that don't work. So that's where they would find this amount to spend. Just because a person is not working doesn't mean they are not clothed, doesn't mean they are not eating, right? So it can come from them begging, etc., right? And then any other spending where the income is now inexistent, we call that induced spending. So the spending, this spending on B and C is called induced spending because it's spending when disposable income is there, right? So this function shows that the higher the disposable income, the higher the consumption expenditure. Think about it. The higher the income you have, the more you can actually spend. So it's going to have an increasing slope, right? And then we have the 45-degree line. So the 45-degree line shows us a height, and it made, okay, so the 45-degree line measures the height of the disposable income, right? So this 45-degree line actually shows me the height of my disposable income. So when my consumption function meets my 45-degree line, it's actually an equilibrium point, right? Where my consumption is equal to my disposable income, right? So that's what I was saying here. So we also, remember we talked about consumption function. Now we are talking about saving function. So on the saving function, this is how the saving function looks. But I want to move you guys to the relationship between the consumption function and the saving function, because together they make disposable income. So remember that this is the consumption line. This is the line that actually ruined the other page. So this is the consumption line. This is my 45-degree line, right? So remember I said on the 45-degree line, it's giving me the heights of my disposable income, right? So and then this black line is my consumption function. If the consumption function is greater than my disposable income, it means that I'm saving. I'm using up more than I have, right? So on the savings function, it's going to be negative. It's going to be below the x-axis, right? And then if my 45-degree line is above the consumption function, it actually means that I am saving because I'm consuming less than the income that I have, right? So I am saving, and the saving function is going to be positive, right? Those are the relationships. And then we move on to what we call the marginal propensity to consume and to save. So these marginal propensities basically show you a fraction of what you are either consuming or saving or paying to tax based on the change of your disposable income. So it's giving you a fraction of what you spend, fraction of what you saved, a fraction of what you paid to taxes based on your change in disposable income. And how you calculate it is that your YD, your disposable income, will always be on your denominator, and whatever propensity you are calculating will go on top. So if you're calculating consumption will go on top. If savings, they will go on top. If taxes, they will go on top. Right? This black marker is ruining my hard work. Okay. So because disposable income goes to consumption and saving, it means that when I add my marginal propensity to consume, because it's a fraction, and my marginal propensity to save, it should give me 1. Because if you think about it, this whole thing is my YD. So my marginal propensity to consume is going to be whatever the X is over YD plus, right? Because I need to get YD at the end of the day, Y over YD. So whatever this amount is plus this amount, it's going to give me my YD. So at the end of the day, it's going to give me 1. So meaning that the change in the amount consumed plus the change in the supply is actually equal to the change in my disposable income. So the marginal propensity to consume is actually the slope of your consumption function because it looks at the change, right? The change in your consumption when disposable income also changes, right? So the MPC is the slope of your consumption function and the MPS is the slope of your savings function. And then we have another interesting function. We have the import function. So the higher the real GDP, the higher the imports. Think about it. If you have more money, you can import more from other countries. So the higher the real GDP, the better the economy is doing, the better the incomes of the people from the economy, then the higher the imports that they are going to have, right? So the relationship between imports and real GDP is determined by the marginal propensity to import, right? And then we look at aggregate planned expenditure. So aggregate planned expenditure looks at all the components. Remember, we are talking about what's consumption expenditure. So we're talking about this component, but now we are talking about the aggregate expenditure. It does not just look at consumption expenditure, but it looks at all the components. It looks at consumption, investment, government spending, exports, less imports, right? And we say that these three, investment, government expenditure, as I explained, they are independent of real GDP. And then C and M are dependent, right, on real GDP. So meaning that I have a graph, but it's on a textbook and copyright issues. So what happens is that for the independent ones, they are going to have be autonomous spending. So meaning that you're gonna have straight lines along the y-axis, right, of investment, of government, and of expenditure. And then these ones are actually gonna form a curve, and together they will form an increasing curve. So if you are showing investment, government, and expenditure, you have to show them as horizontal lines, right? Because they are autonomous, they are not dependent on real GDP. However, this one and this one, they are dependent on real GDP. Okay. So that's what I was explaining here, that consumption expenditure, these are, consumption expenditure minus imports is actually called induced expenditure. And then the ones that are independent of real GDP are called autonomous spending. So, however, remember we're talking about planned expenditure. The actual expenditure is always equal to the real GDP because that's where you find your real GDP from, the actual one, right? However, the planned one, the one that you planned beforehand, is not always equal to the real GDP, right? However, for us to get an equilibrium expenditure, it's going to be at a level where my aggregate expenditure is equal to the planned one, right? So it's going to be at a level where the planned expenditure is equal to the real GDP and the planned one, right? So this is a point where the aggregate expenditure is actually equal to the 45-degree line, right? So we look at this issue of inventories, right? And we look at how inventories change to actually bring you to the equilibrium expenditure. So what happens is that if your 45-degree line is below your aggregate expenditure line, your inventories are lower than what you would like them to be, right? So what is going to happen? If your aggregate expenditure, let me write it in a different color. Your aggregate expenditure in this case is greater because it's on top of the 45-degree line. Means that the business is spending more than it has, right? So your inventories are actually decreasing. However, if your aggregate expenditure line is below the 45-degree line, that means you are spending less, right, than you're spending less than you have in the inventory. So your inventories are going to pile up. Let me explain that. I don't want you guys to miss it. So I am saying that if you are not at equilibrium, the unplanned inventories are going to move you to the equilibrium. But how are they going to do that? They are going to do that in the sense that And given the equilibrium is when your 45-degree line is equal to the aggregate expenditure. If you are not at equilibrium on this segment, when your aggregate expenditure is greater than your aggregate, when your aggregate expenditure is greater than your 45-degree line, it means that you are spending more than you have, right? So what are your inventories going to do? Your inventories are actually going to decrease, right? So whatever you had as excess is going to decrease in the warehouse, right? And then if your 45-degree line is above the aggregate expenditure, it means that you are spending less than you have on the warehouse, right? So your inventories are going to pile up. And when this process occurs, it brings you to the equilibrium. Hope that was clear. Trying to keep this video as short as possible. And then the next thing that we look at is the multiplier. So the multiplier is a very interesting concept because it says that if, for example, you have 100 Rand, that 100 Rand is actually going to multiply by a certain amount, right? It's going to circulate a number of times, right? Which will grow the economy. So let us look at the exact definition. So the multiplier is the amount. So it is the amount by which a change in autonomous spending, right? Not just in anything, but in autonomous spending is multiplied to determine a change in real GDP. So what they are basically saying here is that an amount, right, when autonomous spending changes, for example, when investment changes, when government spending changes, when there's an injection into the economy, the amount that the economy is going to grow by is going to be multiplied, right, by whatever the multiplier value is, right? So if you invested 100 Rand, it's not gonna like grow the economy by 100 Rand, but it's gonna grow the economy in a multiplied way. So that's what the multiplier is basically telling you about. In the equation to calculate a multiplier, we have 3 equations. The first one is a change in equilibrium expenditure over, it's a change in equilibrium expenditure over your change in autonomous spending. These formulas are not given in your formula sheet, so please know them. So we say that the steeper the aggregate expenditure, the bigger the multiplier. And the gentler the aggregate expenditure, the smaller is the multiplier, right? And then we look at what the slope, remember I'm talking about steepness, so now I need to focus on what the slope of the aggregate expenditure is and how it's calculated. So the slope of the aggregate expenditure is actually calculated by saying the change in the induced expenditure over the change in real GDP, right? And remember I said there are 3 ways to calculate the multiplier. It's this way. Then you can calculate the multiplier by saying 1 over 1 minus MPC, or 1 over MPS. Remember that I said MPC plus MPS actually give me 1. So 1 minus MPC is actually MPS. So yeah, so the higher, so an increase in imports and taxes decreases the multiplier. Okay, think about it. Remember what the multiplier says. It says that if you inject into the economy is going to grow by more than what you injected. So if you increase your imports, right, meaning that you're buying in other countries, you are reducing your real GDP. And if there are taxes take away from your disposable income. So if those increase, then they are going to take away from the real GDP. And if they take away from what you are injecting, then they are definitely going to reduce the multiplier. And then aggregate expenditure and aggregate demand. So now we look at the differences between aggregate expenditure and aggregate demand. So aggregate expenditure shows us, remember aggregate expenditure is the total of consumption, investment, government spending, exports minus imports, right? So aggregate expenditure is different from aggregate demand. Aggregate expenditure shows you the relationship between your aggregate expenditure function shows you the relationship between your aggregate expenditure and your real GDP, while your aggregate demand shows you the relationship between your quantity of goods demanded and the price level, right? So these are 2 different curves. This one is increasing because remember we said the higher the real GDP, the more the consumption is going to be, the more the expenditure is going to be. But on the aggregate demand, the higher the price, the lower the quantity demanded. So this one is going to have an upward slope. This one is going to have a downward slope. But those are 2 different curves. This is not the supply curve. It's the aggregate expenditure curve. However, it's going to also have an increasing slope like the aggregate supply, right? So an increase in the price level, anything that changes the aggregate demand, right? So an increase in the price level will cause movements along the aggregate demand. Think about the basic demand. Anything that changes the price causes movements along the demand curve. So an increase in the price level will cause movements along the aggregate demand. However, it will shift the aggregate demand downward, right? And then, because think about it, if the price level, if there's inflation, let me not mix the two. If the price of most of the goods increases, then are you going to be able to spend more or are you going to be able to spend less? You're going to be able to spend less, right? So the aggregate expenditure is going to decrease as a whole because it's going to affect all the components, right? And then a decrease in the price level will cause a movement along the AD, but an increase or shift to the right on the aggregate expenditure. So what you need to take away from here is that change in price level causes movements along the aggregate demand, and changes in price level cause shifts in the aggregate expenditure curve, right? So the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply will both shift when there is a change in the autonomous spending. So whenever there's a change in the autonomous spending, both the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply, the aggregate demand and the aggregate expenditure will both shift, right? So what happens in the short run is that there's going to be an increase, for example, in autonomous spending such as investment. And remember, I said an increase in autonomous spending is going to change both aggregate demand and aggregate expenditure. And an injection is going to be positive in the economy. So an injection is going to increase both of them, right? So the aggregate demand is going to increase and the aggregate expenditure is also going to increase. However, when the aggregate demand increases, the price level also increases, right? And this leads to a decrease in the aggregate expenditure. Remember, a decrease in the price level will cause a movement along the AD, but an increase in the price level will cause a movement along the AD, but shift the AD downward. So autonomous spending will shift both of these curves upward. But when the aggregate demand shifts to the right, the aggregate expenditure is going to shift downward, right? So now that the aggregate expenditure has shifted downward, this causes a mismatch between your potential GDP and your real GDP, and it increases the wage rates and leads to a change or an upward shift in the supply curve. Hence, it keeps the long-run aggregate supply fixed, but the price level increased. So I wanted to show you guys these graphs, but unfortunately, copyright issues. So, and I wasn't able to draw them because they're a bit hard to draw. So I hope this clarifies what you guys were worried about. Let me just tell you what page the graphs are on. Chapter 28, right? So the pages, sorry guys. Yeah, what I was explaining here is on page 659. So you guys can go check that out. So you can check out the graphs. You'll see how there was an increase in aggregate demand and a decrease in aggregate supply that kept the long run aggregate supply where it was, right? So that's what I was explaining here. I said page 659. Thank you so much guys for watching. Please don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. Bye.